my way of looking at Gandhi is informed by two other authors. I'll start by, explaining that. Now, the two other authors are James Douglas, who wrote a little book called Gandhi and the Unspeakable, okay? And it's about his last journey, his last experiment with truth. It focuses on the way Gandhi died and on the circumstances, but it backs up to explain Gandhi more. And then the other person that's going to help us with Gandhi today is Thomas Merton. Merton wrote a very, very important book about Gandhi, which is just an introduction to Gandhi. And then Merton collected a bunch of his quotes, Gandhi's quotes, and wrote in little introductions to each of the sections of quotes. And it's called Gandhi on Nonviolence by Thomas Merton. These two people are going to help us today get through this, because, when you only have half an hour to talk about Gandhi, you need some guidance and some outline. Now, the other thing I'm going to point out as I go through this is that the key for this whole series is the book of James. Now, and the book of James always backs us back into the Beatitudes. So if you have the Beatitudes and the book of James in the background of your consciousness as you listen to the account of the seven witnesses, we'll be able to see that. Now, last time on Monday, we did John Donne as the first witness. The second witness is Gandhi. Now, it begins with a quote from Merton. One of the most significant facts about the life and vocation of Gandhi was his discovery of the East through the West. Like so many others of India during his time, Gandhi received a completely Western education as a young man. And of course, we know he was trained as a lawyer. But Gandhi was unusual in this. Instead of being fooled by the Western costume, and instead of being persuaded that he no longer existed as an Asian, he recognized that he had something good about it that was good not because it was Western, but because it was also Eastern. That is to say, it was universal. So the whole point is that he recognized the universal qualities that existed in the West. So he turned his face and heart once again to India and saw what was really there. Gandhi rediscovered his own tradition and his Hindu religion, they call it dharma, which means religion or duty. He rediscovered his own tradition in light of the spiritual tradition of the West. One of the great lessons in Gandhi's life remains this. Through the spiritual traditions of the West, he, an Indian, discovered his Indian heritage, and with it, his own right mind. Okay? There's a lot about right-mindedness in this journey. And his fidelity to his own heritage and his spiritual sanity, he was able to show men of the West, and indeed of the whole world, a certain way to recover their own right mind and their own tradition, thus manifesting the fact that there are certain indisputable and essential values, religious, ethical, aesthetic, spiritual, philosophical, which man has everywhere needed and which he has in the past managed to acquire. Values without which he cannot live. Values which are now in large measure lost to him, so that unequipped to face life in a fully human manner, he now runs the risk of destroying himself entirely. What you hear there in Merton's quote about Gandhi is the Second Vatican Council's line in Gaudium et Spes that says, unless provision is made for people of greater wisdom, we're in trouble. Now, I just paraphrase the quote because I can't remember the exact quote in Gaudium et Spes, but that's basically what the church teaches there, that provision needs to be made to teach people wisdom because the world needs wisdom in order to overcome the inertia of violence and war. Very interesting here that in the book of James, which I'm, of course, assigning to this whole series, opens up with how to pray for wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproaching, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like the wave of a sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways, will receive anything from the Lord. Well, for Gandhi, in his quest for nonviolence, he discovered the same kind of principle. The spirit of nonviolence springs from an inner relationship of spiritual unity in a person. The whole Gandhian concept of nonviolent action and truth force is incomprehensible if it is thought to be a means of achieving unity rather than the fruit of a unity already achieved. In other words, cleanse the inside of the cup, and the outside of the cup will come clean. See? The spiritual roots of truth force lay even more deeply in Gandhian personal vows of nonviolence, which he had taken recently at the time of his first movement in South Africa. Celibacy, the renunciation of wealth and the service of humanity, especially the poor. It was Gandhi's own path of self-renunciation and service that gave him the profound freedom to call for a nonviolent commitment of the very lives from his people that could change India and the world. Purify the source, he was discovering, and anything was possible. Jim Douglas. Again, look at the book of James. It urges people to purify the source. It has that warning about the tongue being the source of much grave difficulty in life. It also has the warning about the different flow of different kinds of water coming out of the same person, like salt water and fresh water. It can't come out of the same source. So purify the source. 95 years before our tragic 9/11 event in America, there was a remarkable event in South Africa, okay, where Gandhi in 1906, September 11th, ironically enough, in 1906, Gandhi gathered 3,000 people in the Imperial Theater, and they took a pledge before God, both Hindus and Muslims, to be nonviolent. Gandhi's exhortation on that day is worth pondering today. We pledge ourselves, he says, and he warns us about the manner of pledging ourselves to take an oath. To pledge ourselves or to take an oath in the name of God or with him as a witness is not something to be trifled with, he says. If having taken such an oath we violate our pledge, we're guilty before God and man. This pledge was not must not be taken with a view to produce an effect on outsiders. None should trouble to consider what impression it might have on a local government, on the imperial government or the government of India. Everyone must only search his own heart, and if the inner voice assures him that he has the requisite strength to carry him through, then only should he pledge himself, and then only will his pledge bear fruit. A few words now as to the consequences. We may have to go to jail, where we may be insulted. We may have to go hungry and suffer extreme heat and cold. Hard labor may be imposed upon us. We may be flogged by rude warders. We may be fined heavily, and our property may be attached and held up to auction if there are only a few resistors left. Opulent today, we may be reduced to abject poverty tomorrow. We may be deported, suffering from starvation and similar hardships in jail. Some of us may even fall ill and die. But I can boldly declare, and with certainty, that so long as there is even a handful of men true to their pledge, there can be only one end to the struggle, and that is victory. It is possible that the majority of those present here may take the pledge in a fit of enthusiasm or indignation, but may weaken under the ordeal, and only a handful may be left to face the final test. Even then, there is only one course open to someone like me: to die, but not to submit to the law. Everyone should fully realize his responsibility and only pledge himself independently of others, and understand that he himself must be true to his pledge even unto death, no matter what others do. Do you see how his sense of an inner integrity and the inner truth of a person is more important than external consequences? This is key to Gandhi's experience of truth force. Gandhi's way to God was through suffering people. Again, think about the book of James. James says that the way to God is by encountering the poor, right? God chose those who are poor in this world to be rich in faith, heirs to the kingdom that he promised to those who love him. That's one. And then the passage about the poor man and the rich man coming into the church, that's another one in the book of James. There's a number of places. And then there's the challenge in the book of James to recognize that the poor man offers no resistance to the oppression of the rich. Gandhi's way to God was through the suffering of those people. He immersed himself in the everyday details of their lives. There he discovered, through meditation and prayer, nonviolent ways to transform oppression into freedom. In his experiments with truth, Gandhi was developing a deeper, broader power than politicians ever knew. Truth coming forth and ultimately on the awakening power of the poorest, the most enslaved Indians of South Africa, the indentured workers. Gandhi's experiments took that kind of power in hundreds of millions of people in India on his return to India, and the power of the powerless would make him, who had no ambition for power, an increasing threat to those who did have earthly power. The radical politics of Gandhi's notion of truth force would begin to eclipse the established power of dominance. Gandhi's only power in swimming against the imperial tide in India as well as in South Africa was truth force, the nonviolent power of a unified truth lived out by himself and many others regardless of the cost. It's interesting that Gandhi knew personally the people who conspired to assassinate him. This is a remarkable thing. It amazes me as I ponder this, that Gandhi actually debated the man who led the conspiracy to kill him 40 years before he was killed. There was a protracted conflict between Gandhi and this other thinker for 40 years. His name was Vinayak Damodaran Savarkar. The stories of Gandhi and his assassins actually give you an interpretive lens where you can see the different visions of violence and nonviolence, terrorism and truth force, assassination and martyrdom, and how they competed for the future of India. What amazes me is that we can see in Savarkar's statement against Gandhi a kind of blueprint for how violent people think, okay? Savarkar says about his efforts in prison to change the mind of others who were in the same prison for nonviolent resistance. This is what he says. I began here, he wrote in his memoirs, to criticize severely all the followers of Gandhi that they might see more clearly. Winning freedom by the spinning wheel, supporting the Muslims as a movement, and as the duty of Hindus, and the ridiculous definitions of nonviolence. He says, I exploded them all by invincible logic and by an appeal to history. Invincible logic and an appeal to history to defeat Gandhi's arguments in the 1920s ends up with Gandhi's assassination in the 1940s. There's obviously a deep divide between these two men. One of these aspects of the divide was religious, okay? And for Gandhi, Hinduism was a way of wisdom and discipline in order to foster truth and love. For Savarkar, Hinduism is a tribal reality which needs violent methods of defense, including revenge killing and elimination of its enemies by force. Gandhi, in the last 2 years of his life, had to confront the violence in the Muslims and created by the conflict between the Muslims, the Hindus, and the Sikhs. In his dismay, this is what he said. There was a time when nobody believed that India could win her independence by nonviolence. But now that independence has become a reality, we are bidding a fair goodbye to nonviolence. If India has no further use for nonviolence, can she have any for me? I would not in the least be surprised if, in spite of all the homage the national leaders paid me, they would one day say, we've had enough of this old man. Will he not leave us alone? When he traveled through the villages of the regions where much violence had taken place, he reflected, the more I go about in these parts, the more I find that your worst enemy is fear. The terrorist as well as the terrorized are equally its victims. It eats into their vitals. That's what he says. The former fears something in his victim. I may be the latter's religion, which is different from the terrorists, or the latter's riches. And so in other words, the separation may come from religion or come from wealth. But there has never been, and there will never be a man who can intimidate one who has cast out fear in his heart. Because the fearless man makes God his sole refuge. Unless we cultivate this kind of fearlessness, he said, there will never be peace in these parts for the Hindus and the Muslims. So we step back, we think about Gandhi's journey for a minute, and we have to go back to Merton. And Merton has what I consider to be one of the clearest quotes that kind of fits our own times really incredibly. So I want you to just hear Thomas Merton reflecting on Gandhi here. Okay? The question remains the same. It's a crisis of sanity, first of all. The problems of the nations are the problems of mentally deranged people, but magnified 1,000 times because they have the full, straight-faced approbation of a schizoid society, schizoid national structures, schizoid military and business complexes, and need one, add schizoid religious sects. We are at war with ourselves. He's quoting another thinker there. And therefore at war with one another. Western man is unbalanced, and the question is, can he recover himself? It's a very real question. And not only that, but it's not just for Western man, it's for everybody at this point. The proper sphere of every man's being is of logic, of courage, and wisdom. And the sphere where he operates that is in the public and political realm. In that realm, he shares words and deeds, thus contributing his share of action and thought to the fabric of human affairs. Now, the public and political realm is that where issues are decided in a way worthy of free man, by persuasion and words, and not by violence. Violence is essentially wordless, and it can begin only where thought and rational communication have broken down, and any society which is geared for violent action is by that fact simultaneously unreasonable. Thought is not encouraged, and the exchange of ideas is eschewed with all manner of risk. Words are kept at a minimum, at least as far as their variety and content may be considered, though they may pour over the armed multitude in cataracts. In other words, cataracts there meaning floods, like in the scripture. Like cataracts flow over me, right? So he's saying that this flood of words in the violent situation just become noise. And they are simply organized in an articulate noise designed to arrest thought. Listen to this. To arrest thought and release violence, and inhibiting all desire to communicate with the enemy, but by any way but destructive impact. It cannot be too often repeated that with Gandhi, nonviolence was not simply marginal and quasi-fanatical indulgence of a personal religious feeling. It belonged to the very nature of political life. Gandhi has to be remembered as a political figure, and a political figure who died in the service of his truth. And so when you see that, and you see the scope of it, you have to kind of ask yourself, what were some of the points of his wisdom that we can carry with us into our journey? And I would suggest that one of the most dramatic moments in his journey was this. There was a reporter named Sheehan who felt like Gandhi was going to die soon. And so he traveled to India to see Gandhi. And upon encountering Gandhi, he did an interview with him. And this was like 2 days before he died. And then Sheehan was going to meet with Gandhi right after the speech that Gandhi was going to give when Gandhi was killed. Okay? So here's the last conversation between this American reporter and Gandhi. Sheehan said, I propose to begin with action and the fruits of action. Gandhi stopped walking. He needed to make a point. He looked up at Sheehan with a bird-like motion. Let me get one thing clear, he said. I have typhoid fever. Doctors are sent for, and by means of injections of sulfa drugs or something of the kind, they save my life. This, however, proves nothing. It might be that it would be more valuable to humanity for me to die. Gandhi gazed up at Sheehan. He waited for the point that it might be more valuable for humanity for him to die to sink in. Is that quite clear, he asked? If it is not, I will repeat it. No, sir, said Sheehan. I think I understand it. The two men resumed walking. Then Sheehan, how can a righteous battle produce a catastrophic result? Asked Sheehan. He was thinking especially World War II. Because of the means used, Gandhi said. Means are not to be distinguished from ends. Gandhi had been challenged on this insight by Savarkar during their conflict in London over the question of using assassinations, as Savarkar's group was doing to achieve national liberation. Impossible, said Gandhi to Savarkar and his student militants. Now Gandhi was explaining the coherence of means and ends all over again to Sheehan, 3 days before Gandhi would be assassinated by a more recent follower of Savarkar. Gandhi said, if violent means are used, there will be a bad result. Is this true at all times and places? Sheehan asked. I say so, Gandhi said. The terms are convertible. No good act can produce an evil result. Evil means, even for a good end, produce evil results. Sheehan would not let go. I was thinking of our war against Hitler, which in my view was a righteous battle. I knew some of the leaders on our side. Gandhi nodded, which Sheehan took to mean Gandhi's agreement that both Roosevelt and Churchill had been righteous in intention. Sheehan continued, how can such a truly righteous battle as our fight against the evil of fascism produce the result which now faces us? Gandhi leaned towards Sheehan. He said gently, but with great sadness, your ends may have been good, but your means were bad. That is not the way of truth. Those who govern us, Sheehan said, are obviously concerned with the fruits of action rather than with the truth of action. How then are we to be well governed? Gandhi answered, you must give up the worship of mammon, Gandhi said. Sheehan knew Gandhi meant Americans had to stop worshiping mammon. Gandhi outlined for Sheehan a vision of representative democracy in which those who were corrupted could be recalled from office by those who were not. He paused, then added, have nothing to do with power. Do you mean that power corrupts? Asked Sheehan. Yes, Gandhi said. I'm afraid I do mean that power corrupts. Yet, as Gandhi knew, he was not going to give up counseling people corrupted by power, including his own disciples in the Indian government. He meant he would never seek power himself, nor should anyone seek power who is experimenting in the ultimate force of truth through nonviolence. So you hear his advice to the reporter. You give up mammon, You give up the power of mammon, and you align yourself with truth, and then suddenly the world changes. And that's very much the message of the book of James too. You see that as well. And you see that Gandhi was an incredible witness for peace in our times, because he didn't mess up the relationship between means and ends. And he held firm to the gospel, what I'd call the gospel of nonviolence. Okay, thank you.